When Emma thought about the early years of her marriage, she remembered warmth, laughter, and the easy way Mark used to look at her like the rest of the world had faded into the background. And for a long time she believed that kind of connection, once built, would never really disappear. It might get quieter, maybe less exciting, but not vanish, not like it slowly did, piece by piece, without either of them saying when the unraveling began. Only that one day she woke up and realized her husband had stopped being the man she married, and that realization did not strike in a single dramatic moment, but seeped in through 100 little details she kept trying to ignore until ignoring them became impossible. At first it was subtle, the way he stopped asking about her day with genuine interest, the way his eyes drifted to the television or his phone while she talked about work, the way his laugh, once quick and loud and contagious, turned into a short exhale that sounded more like obligation than joy. On the surface, nothing catastrophic had happened. They still lived in the same apartment, slept in the same bed, shared the same kitchen and bills and routines. But beneath that thin layer of normalcy, something fundamental had shifted, and Emma felt it in the way silence started to grow between them, at first only in the evenings, when they both came home tired, then in the mornings, when his good morning became a mumbled phrase tossed over his shoulder while he reached for his coffee, and she found herself standing at the counter with her own mug, staring at his back, feeling like she was sharing a home with someone whose body she recognized but whose presence felt strangely hollow. The man she married had once been attentive to details, the kind of person who remembered that she hated coriander and loved thunderstorms, who noticed when she got a new haircut or when she wore the sweater her grandmother had knitted. Now he moved around her like the furniture, stepping past her, not into her, and she kept asking herself if she was being dramatic, if this was just what long-term relationships became, the fading of fire into embers, the shift from passion to coexistence. Yet there was a difference between calm and cold, and what she felt from him more and more was not calm, not comfort, but a distance that seemed to thicken the air around him. He came home later than before, always with an explanation ready. Traffic, meetings, a project that had gone off track, a colleague who needed help, and none of those reasons sounded impossible, but it was the way he delivered them that made her uneasy. There was no frustration in his voice about the long hours, no venting about annoying coworkers, just a quiet, practiced neutrality that felt like a wall she could not see through. When she asked if everything was okay at work, he would shrug and say it was fine, then change the subject, sometimes to something trivial like which streaming show everyone at the office was talking about, and she would nod, trying to follow along, while inside her chest a tiny knot tightened a little more each day. On weekends he used to plan small things for the two of them, nothing extravagant. A walk by the river, breakfast at the cafe she liked, a movie night with blankets and takeout. Lately his weekends were full of vague tasks, errands he needed to run alone, a vague promise to catch up on rest that did not match the restless pacing she heard when he moved around the apartment. And when she suggested they do something together, he would often say he was tired or that he needed to prepare for the next week, leaving her sitting on the couch scrolling aimlessly through her phone, watching other couples post about trips or dinners or small moments filled with affection, wondering when her own marriage had started to feel like a room she had to tiptoe through so as not to disturb a stranger. The physical intimacy changed too, but not in the way people sometimes describe with dramatic withdrawal overnight. Theirs faded like a photo left too long in sunlight. The hugs that once lingered became quick, one arm, distracted. The kisses shifted from soft and engaged to quick brushes of lips that tasted like habit. And as much as Emma tried to tell herself it was normal for things to cool down over time, there was something different now. Because it was not just the frequency that changed, but the intention behind it, or rather the absence of intention. The sense that his body was there, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. Sometimes she would wake in the middle of the night and feel the empty space beside her, the warmth gone from where he should have been lying, and she would hear faint sounds from the living room, the murmur of the television, the soft creak of the floor as he walked back and forth. And when he eventually returned to bed, if she pretended to be asleep, he would slide under the covers with the careful movements of someone who did not want to disturb a stranger rather than a partner. When she did speak up and ask what was wrong, he would always say the same thing, that he could not sleep, that he had things on his mind. But when she gently asked what things, he would tighten his jaw and say it was nothing. And she knew from years of watching his face that he was not lying exactly, but he was refusing to open the door to whatever room inside him those thoughts lived in, and that hurt more than a direct blow. One Tuesday evening, she watched him enter the apartment with the same mechanical way he had been using lately, dropping his keys in the bowl, loosening his tie, kicking off his shoes, but instead of greeting her with a kiss or a question, he moved straight to the sink to wash his hands, his shoulders hunched, his eyes distant, and Emma stood at the kitchen counter cutting vegetables for dinner. The knife moving rhythmically against the board while her mind spun, she watched him from the corner of her eye, seeing the profile of his face, the same sharp lines she had once traced with her fingers in the dark, and she realized with a sharp jolt that she did not know what he was thinking at all, not even a little. Once she could read his mood with a glance. Now his expression might as well have belonged to a stranger on the street. When he finally turned to her and asked a generic "How was your day?" she felt a wave of frustration rise beneath the usual polite answer she wanted. To say it was lonely, that it felt like sharing air with a ghost, that she missed him, the real him, the one who used to sit at this very table and tell her about some silly thing that had happened at work, making her laugh so hard she spilled her drink. Instead, she said it was fine, and the word tasted bitter. Over the following weeks, that bitterness grew, not into loud fights, but into quiet resentments that shadowed their every interaction. Emma started catching herself rehearsing conversations in her head where she asked him plainly what was going on, demanding to know why he seemed so far away even when he was sitting right next to her. But each time the words reached her throat, they got stuck, because she was afraid of the answers. Afraid that naming what she felt would make it real, afraid that he would confirm the terrifying suspicion that had started to form in the back of her mind that somehow, somewhere along the way, he had stepped out of the life they had built together and into a different one she knew nothing about. The signs were there if she let herself examine them. The way he flinched almost imperceptibly when she touched his arm unexpectedly, the way he locked his phone more often than before, not obsessively, but enough that she noticed. The way he avoided making plans more than a few days ahead, always saying they should see how the week turned out, as if committing to anything in the future felt too heavy. One night, she was washing dishes while he sat on the couch staring at the television with an empty gaze, the sound low, just a background hum, and she felt a strange clarity cut through the fog of her confusion. It occurred to her that if she had walked into the room as an outsider, she would not have identified them as a loving couple. They could have been roommates, or distant relatives forced to share a space, and the thought made her chest ache with a deep, quiet grief. She dried her hands slowly, then turned off the kitchen light and leaned against the counter, watching him. The flickering TV glow reflecting on his face, highlighting how tired he looked, not just physically but in the soul. And in that moment she knew she could not keep pretending that this was just a phase they would magically grow out of. Something inside her had to break or change or finally speak, because if she continued living like this, with her heart pressed against a closed door, she would eventually disappear into the silence herself. And as she stood there, trying to gather courage that felt foreign in her own body, he reached for the remote and turned off the television, plunging the room into a deeper kind of quiet. Then he pressed his fingers against the bridge of his nose like a man carrying something heavy, and Emma realized that the conversation she had been avoiding was no longer something she could postpone, that the moment had arrived when she would have to look at the stranger wearing her husband's face and ask him where along the way he had left the man she married behind. Emma felt her heart beating fast as she stood facing him, the room surrounded by a silence that felt heavier than any argument they had ever had. She studied his face, trying to recognize the man she once believed she could read effortlessly, but the expression staring back at her was distant, guarded, almost like a mask he wore too comfortably. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words tangled inside her chest. The fear of breaking something fragile held her still, and for a moment she wondered if staying quiet was worse than the truth she was avoiding. She watched the way he rubbed the back of his neck, a nervous habit he had when he felt cornered, yet he would not meet her eyes. When she finally found her voice, it came softer than she intended. She asked him what was wrong, what had changed, what was happening to the man who once held her like she was the safest place in his world. He breathed out slowly, the kind of breath that carries weight, but his answer was a shrug that made her stomach twist. His lack of expression felt like a door closing, and Emma felt her fingers tighten on the edge of the counter. She wished he would break, shout, confess something, anything that resembled the passion he once carried so easily. Instead, he simply told her he was tired, that work was stressful, that she shouldn't worry so much. The words sounded like puzzle pieces forced into the wrong picture. She wanted to believe him, but she could feel the space between them widening, stretching into something she could no longer reach across. She stepped closer, hoping the physical distance closing would bridge the emotional one too, but he took half a step back. That small movement cut sharper than anything he could have said. Emma felt her breath catch, her throat tightening, as if she'd swallowed something sharp. He didn't even seem to realize he had moved away, and that hurt most of all, because it proved the instinct she feared was real. He was drifting without noticing she was still holding on. She asked him again, a little more firmly, why he seemed so far away, why he no longer looked at her like he used to, why his presence felt like a shadow instead of a partner. This time he looked up, but the expression in his eyes was unreadable, like a storm she couldn't see through. He told her she was imagining things, that she was stressed, that things were fine. The tone was steady, rehearsed, almost too calm for the magnitude of what she was asking. She felt her hands shake slightly at her sides, anger mixing with sadness in a way that left her unsure whether to cry or scream. She didn't do either. Instead, she watched him walk past her, heading toward the hallway with the same distant gait she had started recognizing as his new normal. As he disappeared into the darkened corridor, Emma felt the air around her shift, colder, heavier, full of unanswered questions. She stood alone in the quiet kitchen, her pulse echoing in her ears, realizing that this was not a phase, not a bad week, not something that would resolve itself if she just waited long enough. The truth felt closer now, pressing at the walls around her, demanding to be acknowledged. And as she leaned against the counter, staring at the empty doorway where he had just stood, she understood something she had not wanted to admit. The man she married was slipping away, and she had no idea how to hold on to someone who had already let go. Emma didn't sleep that night. She lay awake listening to the faint rhythm of his breathing beside her, wondering how two bodies could share the same bed and still feel separated by miles of silence. She watched the ceiling, replaying their conversation again and again, searching for something she might have missed. When she turned her head to look at him, he was facing away, curled slightly toward the edge of the mattress. He used to sleep close, sometimes draping an arm over her waist without even waking. Now he slept like someone protecting his own space, and she felt the cold air between them like a barrier she wasn't allowed to cross. In the morning, he acted as though nothing had happened. He moved around the room with practiced calm, gathering his keys, tying his shoes, offering her a quiet, "See you later," that sounded more like a formality than affection. Emma stood in the hallway watching him leave, her heart sinking as the door clicked shut. She walked into the living room and sank onto the couch, pulling her knees to her chest. For the first time, she allowed herself to fully consider the possibility that this change in him was not temporary. It was terrifying, the idea that a person could shift so drastically and still insist everything was fine. Throughout the day, she tried to distract herself with work, but her thoughts kept circling back to him, his distant eyes, the way he avoided touch, the emotionless tone in his voice. She couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was happening beneath the surface, something he either couldn't explain or refused to. When he came home that evening, the atmosphere felt even heavier. Emma tried to initiate small conversations, but his answers were short and detached, as though he were speaking from somewhere far away. Every pause stretched into an uncomfortable silence that neither of them dared to fill. She offered to cook dinner together, something they used to enjoy, but he declined without offering a real reason. Watching him sit at the table, scrolling through his phone with distant eyes, made her chest tighten. He used to share everything with her, his stress, his excitement, his frustrations, but now his world felt locked behind a door she no longer had the key to. At one point she reached out and gently touched his hand on the table. He flinched almost imperceptibly, a tiny movement that said more than any words could. Emma withdrew her hand slowly, her breath unsteady, realizing that she no longer recognized the man in front of her. After dinner, he retreated to the bedroom, saying he needed to rest. Emma remained in the living room, staring at the dimly lit space they had built together. The pictures on the wall, the small souvenirs from their trips, the soft light from the lamp. Everything in the apartment still felt like them, except him. She felt something inside her start to crumble. The fear she had been trying to ignore evolved into a quiet certainty something was deeply wrong, and he was shutting her out of whatever world he now lived in. And the worst part was that she didn't know if he ever intended to let her back in. As she sat alone in the silence, Emma realized she wasn't just missing the man he used to be. She was mourning him. Emma began noticing details she had once overlooked, the little ways his presence in the apartment had changed. His jacket was no longer tossed over the back of a chair when he came home. Instead, he hung it with mechanical precision, as if he needed control over objects because he had lost control over something else. His shoes lined up neatly by the door, his keys always in the same spot, his routines increasingly rigid. That new rigidity did not feel like discipline. It felt like armor. She found herself studying him the way one might study a stranger in a waiting room, searching for clues in his posture and gestures. When he checked his phone, his jaw clenched. When she laughed at something on television, his eyes flicked toward her but quickly drifted away, as though he were observing a distant sound rather than sharing the moment. One evening, she decided she could not keep existing around him without trying, one last time, to reach the man she still believed might be buried under all that distance. She waited until after dinner, when the plates were cleared and the sink hummed softly, and then she turned off the tap and dried her hands slowly, forcing herself not to shy away. She walked into the living room and found him there on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, staring at nothing in particular. The television was off, his phone face down on the coffee table, his posture slumped in a way that looked less relaxed and more defeated. For a brief second, he seemed fragile, and that glimpse of vulnerability gave her courage. She sat down beside him, leaving a small space between them. Not as much as he usually left, but enough to respect the invisible line he kept drawing. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence buzzed around them, full of everything they had avoided saying. Emma took a breath that shook on the way in. She told him, calmly at first, that she felt like she was living with a stranger. She said she didn't know how to talk to him anymore, that she missed who they used to be, that it hurt to feel invisible in a life they had built together. Her voice trembled, but she didn't back away from the words. He stayed very still as she spoke, his gaze fixed on his hands. The muscles in his forearms tensed, then relaxed, like he was trying to hold something in place inside himself. When she finished, the room felt heavier, as if even the furniture were waiting for his response. For a long time he said nothing. Then he leaned back, pressing his head against the back of the couch, and exhaled in a way that sounded almost like surrender. He told her he knew he had been distant. He admitted that he wasn't proud of the way he'd been acting, that he felt wrong, somehow, but didn't know how to explain it. The honesty, however small, hit her like a sudden light in a dark room. She asked him, gently, what wrong meant. Was it their marriage, his job, something she had done, something he had done? The question spilled out more quickly than she intended, and she watched his shoulders tense again, as if each word added weight across his back. He said it wasn't her. The phrase came automatically, the way people say it in movies, but something about his tone made it feel genuine rather than decorative. He told her he was tired all the time, not just physically but in some deeper place. That he felt disconnected from everything, from work, from friends, from himself. She listened, her heart pounding, torn between relief that he was finally saying something real and fear of what might come next. She asked him why he hadn't told her any of this sooner, why he had chosen to pull away instead of letting her in. His answer came slowly. He said he didn't want to be the problem in their life, that he felt weak admitting he was struggling. That every day, he woke up and put on a version of himself he thought everyone expected, and somewhere in that process he had lost track of the person he used to be. Emma felt tears burn her eyes. It hurt, hearing how far he had drifted from himself, but it also revealed a truth she hadn't considered, that she wasn't just losing him, he was losing himself too. The stranger in her home was not some new man who had taken her husband's place. He was the same man, worn down, submerged under layers of silent exhaustion. She reached for his hand again, slower this time, giving him time to pull away if he wanted to. He didn't. His fingers tensed at her touch, but he didn't withdraw. That small acceptance felt like a fragile bridge, finally lowering across a chasm she had been staring into for weeks. She told him she didn't need him to be perfect or to perform some version of being okay. She just needed him to stop disappearing behind this wall of polite distance. She wanted the truth, even if it was messy, even if it hurt, even if it meant admitting that they were not as unbreakable as they once believed. He swallowed hard, eyes still fixed downward. He confessed that sometimes he felt like he was failing at everything at once, that the expectations, spoken and unspoken, had become so heavy he had started shutting down rather than risk disappointing her, that the silence felt easier than trying to explain feelings he barely understood. Those words pierced her in a way she didn't expect. She had grown so focused on her own pain that she hadn't fully considered the shape of his. She realized she had been measuring his distance only as rejection, not as a symptom of a deeper fracture inside him. Emma told him that watching him pull away without explanation felt like being abandoned in slow motion. She said she couldn't keep living in a home where every conversation felt like walking on cracked glass, where she was afraid to ask how he was because she feared the answer would confirm her worst fears. He finally looked at her then, really looked at her for the first time in what felt like months. In his eyes, she saw guilt and fatigue and something like regret. But she also saw a faint, flickering recognition, as if he were seeing her again not as part of his environment, but as a person he was actively choosing to face. He admitted that he didn't know how to fix things. Not with a single conversation, not with a promise, not with a weekend away. He said he wasn't sure who he was anymore, and that terrified him. The man she married had always seemed so sure of himself. Hearing him say the opposite made the ground tilt beneath her. Emma squeezed his hand, her own fear threatening to swallow her. She told him they didn't need a perfect answer in that moment, but they needed something, a beginning, a step toward each other instead of away. She said she could handle almost anything except silence and slow disappearance. For a moment it seemed like he might retreat again, close the door and sink back into himself. Instead, he nodded once, just enough to break the stillness. He agreed that he couldn't go on like this either. He said he would try, though the words sounded tentative, as if he didn't quite trust himself to follow through. It wasn't the grand declaration she had secretly hoped for. There were no sweeping promises or dramatic apologies. But it was real, and real was all she had been asking for. Sitting there on the couch, their hands loosely intertwined, Emma understood that whatever came next would not be easy. The man beside her was still not the man she had married. Not yet, but for the first time in a long time, she felt that somewhere beneath the stranger's surface, he was at least reaching back. And for that moment, fragile as it was, she chose not to let go. Emma woke the next morning with a cautious hope settled somewhere deep in her chest, a feeling too fragile to name. She lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the apartment, wondering if the conversation from the night before had shifted something real or if it was just a temporary crack in the wall he had built around himself. When she entered the kitchen, he was already there, leaning against the counter with a mug of coffee in his hands. His posture seemed softer, less tense, though shadows still lingered beneath his eyes. He greeted her in a voice that wasn't quite warm, but wasn't cold either, somewhere in between, somewhere uncertain. They moved around each other with a different energy, still awkward, but not as distant. At one point their arms brushed lightly, and neither of them stepped away. Emma noticed the small change, the absence of recoil, and it filled her with a quiet, trembling relief she did not dare express aloud. Throughout the day, she found herself replaying his words in her mind. The admission of feeling lost, of not recognizing himself, of shutting down under pressure he had never voiced. She had expected betrayal, anger, or confession of something concrete. Instead, she found herself holding the weight of his vulnerability, a softer wound than she expected, but a wound nonetheless. That evening, she returned home to find him sitting at the dining table with papers spread out around him. He looked up, startled, as though he hadn't expected her to arrive so soon. When he apologized for the mess, she realized he hadn't sat at that table to work in weeks. That simple shift, choosing a shared space instead of isolating himself in the bedroom, felt like a small, deliberate step toward her. They ate dinner quietly, but the silence felt different now. Not hostile, not empty, more like two people trying to figure out how to speak a language they used to know fluently but had forgotten over time. After the dishes were done, Emma walked into the living room and found him standing near the bookshelf, running his fingers over the framed photos, pictures of their vacations, birthdays, spontaneous moments. He paused at one where they were both laughing so openly that their eyes had disappeared into creases. She approached slowly, unsure if interrupting would break the delicate spell. When he glanced at her, she saw something flicker across his face, recognition, nostalgia, maybe even longing. He held the frame a moment longer before setting it back in its place. He confessed that he sometimes missed the version of himself in those photos. The man who smiled easily, who wasn't weighed down by invisible burdens. Emma felt her breath catch, because she missed that version too, but hearing him acknowledge it made her feel less alone in her grief. She stepped closer, her voice soft as she told him that the man in the pictures wasn't gone, just buried. That people change, sometimes painfully, but change didn't have to mean loss. He listened without looking at her, his shoulders rising and falling with slow breaths. When he finally met her eyes, there was a rawness there she hadn't seen in months. A small piece of truth breaking through the fog. He said he didn't know how to find his way back, and she told him he didn't have to do it alone. He nodded, not with certainty, but with willingness. And willingness, Emma realized, was the first real foundation they had touched in a long time. Later that night, as they settled into bed, the space between them felt slightly smaller. Not gone, but no longer an impenetrable void. She felt him shift closer, just enough for his arm to brush against hers beneath the blanket. It wasn't affection. It wasn't comfort. It was simply presence, and for now that was enough. Emma stared into the darkness, letting her breath fall and sink with his. She didn't know what their future held, or how long it would take to rebuild what had cracked. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a spark, faint, trembling, but unmistakably alive. And she knew she wasn't ready to give up on him yet. Emma began noticing small shifts in him, fragile enough to doubt, but meaningful enough to matter. He still carried a heaviness in the slope of his shoulders, but there were moments, brief, flickering moments, when something familiar seemed to rise to the surface, like an ember glowing beneath weeks of ash. One evening, she walked into the kitchen and found him washing dishes without being asked. It wasn't grand or dramatic, but the simple act, done willingly, felt new somehow. Emma leaned against the doorway, watching him for a moment, seeing intention in a place where there had been only distance. When he finally noticed her, he turned with a look that mixed surprise and a hint of embarrassment. She offered a small smile, soft, careful, and he returned one of his own, short and uncertain, but undeniably real. That brief exchange settled over her like something rare, something that could vanish if either of them moved too quickly. Later, as they sat together on the couch, Emma noticed the way he held his phone. Not guarded, not angled away. When she sat beside him, he placed it face up on the coffee table, a small gesture that sent a quiet rush of warmth through her chest. He didn't explain it, and she didn't point it out. They both let the moment breathe. In the days that followed, Emma watched him with a new kind of awareness. Sometimes he seemed present again, asking about her day, actually listening, his eyes softening in ways she hadn't seen in months. Other times, he slipped back into himself, distant and unreachable, sinking into thoughts he couldn't share. Those regressions hurt, but she began to see them differently, not as rejections, but as signs of a man trying to rebuild something inside himself one unsteady step at a time. Healing, she realized, was rarely a straight line. One night in bed, she felt his hand find hers beneath the covers. It was hesitant, almost shy, as though he were asking permission. She wove her fingers through his without speaking. He let out a quiet exhale, the kind that carried relief rather than tension. In that small gesture, she sensed a shift, not a return to who he used to be, but the beginning of someone trying to reconnect, slowly and painfully, with the world he had shut out. Still, in quiet moments, Emma found herself wondering whether he still loved her the same way. Had the shape of his love changed? Had it dimmed or simply transformed? She didn't know. She wasn't sure she wanted to know yet. As he fell asleep beside her, breathing more peacefully than he had in weeks, Emma turned slightly to face him. In the dim light, she studied the soft outline of his features, and for the first time since everything had begun, she didn't see only a stranger. She saw traces of the man she married, flickering beneath the surface. And in that fragile, almost invisible glimmer, she found a reason to believe there might still be a way back for them. Emma began adjusting to the delicate rhythm their days now carried, a rhythm shaped by careful steps forward and unavoidable steps back. The house felt quieter, but the silence was no longer empty. It was watchful, patient, as though both of them were trying to relearn how to exist in the same space without breaking the fragile progress they had made. Some evenings, he seemed more alive than others. He would sit beside her on the couch, rather than across the room, or ask her opinion about something insignificant just to keep the conversation moving. Those small efforts warmed her, even when they came wrapped in hesitation. They were signs of a man trying, even if he didn't know how to try the right way yet. But there were still moments when his gaze went far away, drifting somewhere she couldn't follow. Emma would call his name gently, and he would blink as if waking from a dream, offering a quiet apology he never explained. She realized those moments weren't personal. They were pieces of whatever internal struggle he was facing, shadows that tugged at him from places he still didn't know how to navigate. She began noticing that he spent more time near her in simple ways, sitting at the table while she folded laundry, lingering in the doorway when she cooked, walking beside her at the store when before he might have stayed home. He didn't fill those moments with chatter, but his presence itself felt like a choice, a silent acknowledgement that he didn't want to drift further. One night, Emma found him on the balcony, leaning against the railing, staring at the city lights. His face looked softer in the glow, less guarded. She stepped beside him quietly, and to her surprise, he didn't close off or move away. Instead, he shifted a little to make room for her. They stood together without speaking, listening to the muted hum of traffic. After a while, he told her he didn't recognize himself anymore. His voice was low, nearly swallowed by the night air. He said he felt like he'd been running from something inside him without even realizing it. Fear, pressure, expectations, he wasn't sure what. But that pulling away from her had been an attempt to shield her from the storm he didn't know how to explain. Emma felt her chest tighten at his confession. She told him she didn't need him to be perfect or strong or unshakable. She just needed him to let her stand beside him, even if the ground was uneven. Her voice trembled, but she remained steady, watching the way emotion flickered across his expression like distant lightning. He apologized then, not dramatically, not with flourishes, but with a softness that made it sound genuine. He said he never meant to make her feel alone, that he hadn't realized how far he drifted until he saw the hurt in her eyes. The sincerity hit her deeply, stirring a mixture of relief and heartbreak. For a long moment they stood there, neither reaching for the other, but something between them warm enough to fill the space. Emma felt his shoulder brush hers, a subtle gesture that wasn't accidental this time. She turned slightly toward him, feeling the closeness settle into something steady, something promising. Inside the apartment later, as they prepared for bed, she noticed him glancing at her with an expression she hadn't seen in months, a look that carried familiarity and something close to longing. He seemed unsure, hesitant, as though he didn't want to move too fast and risk breaking the fragile new ground they'd found. When he finally lay beside her, he turned to face her in the dark. Emma felt her heart lift as his hand reached for hers again, more confidently this time. Their fingers intertwined beneath the blanket, and he held her hand like it was the first stable thing he'd touched in weeks. In that quiet moment, Emma realized something significant. He wasn't just inching back toward her, he was finding his way back to himself too. And for the first time in a long time, the space between them felt less like a void and more like a path. Emma woke with a quiet sense of clarity she hadn't felt in months. As she lay still, she realized she was no longer bracing for disappointment or silence. The room felt different, lighter somehow, not because everything was fixed, but because something inside both of them had shifted enough to breathe again. When she entered the kitchen, he was there, sitting at the table with 2 mugs of coffee. One was placed at her usual spot. It startled her in the gentlest way. He looked up when she walked in, and there was a softness in his eyes she thought she might never see again. They sat across from each other, the morning light settling quietly on their faces. He cleared his throat before speaking, an anxious gesture, but not the guarded one she had grown used to. He told her he had been thinking, really thinking, about what she said, about what he said, about how they had both been moving through the same house as if trapped behind invisible walls. He admitted he didn't know how long it would take to become himself again. He didn't know if the version he used to be was even reachable, or if he needed to grow into someone new entirely. But he promised that he didn't want to keep living as a stranger beside her. That whatever path he had walked down, he didn't want to keep walking it alone. Emma listened, her pulse loud in her ears, not because of fear, but because these words felt like something real, raw and unpolished, but real. She told him she didn't want the old version of him back. She wanted him, whoever he was now, whatever he was becoming. She wanted honesty, presence, effort, not perfection. He reached across the table and took her hand with a steadiness she hadn't felt from him in so long. There was no hesitation this time, no withdrawal. His hand wrapped around hers like he meant it, like he remembered something important and was holding on to it with intention. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence felt warm, full of something alive. It wasn't the silence of distance anymore, but the silence of two people rediscovering how to meet in the middle. Later, as they walked into the living room together, he stopped by the bookshelf again. His eyes lingered on a photo of the two of them laughing, younger, lighter, unaware of the storms that would one day test them. He traced the edge of the frame with his thumb, and Emma saw something quiet and hopeful settle into his expression. He said he wasn't sure if they could ever return to who they were in that photo. Emma stepped beside him and told him they didn't have to. They could build something new. He looked at her then, really looked, with the kind of gaze that carried both apology and promise. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the man standing in front of her no longer felt like a stranger. He felt like someone coming home. Emma took his hand again, and this time he pulled her gently into a slow embrace, careful, steady, and full of intention. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth settle into her chest. It wasn't a perfect ending, not a sudden fix, not a miracle. It was the first honest beginning they had touched in a very long time. And as they stood there, holding each other in the quiet of the living room they once feared had lost its warmth, Emma knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. A stranger no longer, but a husband finding his way back.